The morning of June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m. Pacific Ocean, 325 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the flag bridge, still recovering from his emergency appendectomy 10 days earlier. Below him, the flight deck swarmed with activity. Fuel hoses snaked across wooden planking, ordnance carts positioned beside waiting bombers, every plane being prepared for launch against the American carriers that had finally been spotted. The carriers were at their most vulnerable state possible. Fuchida, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, watched the frantic preparations with growing unease. Something felt wrong. The returning strike aircraft from Midway were landing, being struck below, rearmed, and brought back up in a constant cycle that violated every safety protocol. Bombs and torpedoes littered the hangar decks. Aviation fuel pooled on metal surfaces. The ship had become a floating bomb magazine. Then he heard them, the high-pitched scream of dive bombers cutting through air. He looked up, black shapes plummeting from 14,000 feet at 70-degree angles. American SBD Dauntless bombers, dozens of them, falling like rain onto ships that had no time to react, no way to defend, no means to escape. In 5 minutes, everything Japan had calculated, everything they had planned, everything they believed would happen at Midway would be consumed by fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how Japan's most meticulously planned operation became its most catastrophic defeat, you must go back 4 months. Back to the moment when American bombers appeared in the skies over Tokyo. Back to April 18th, 1942, when the Doolittle Raid shattered the illusion of homeland invulnerability. The raid itself caused minimal physical damage. 16 B-25 bombers launching from the carrier Hornet, flying over 650 miles, dropping their payloads on Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya before attempting desperate flights to China. Most of the bombers crash-landed. Several crews were captured. The destruction was negligible, but the psychological earthquake was profound. The Japanese military had sworn to protect the emperor from all harm. Now American bombers had struck the heart of the empire. Someone had to take responsibility. More importantly, someone had to ensure it never happened again. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, already knew the answer. He had been pushing for it since January. Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll. Yamamoto understood something that few in Tokyo truly grasped. Time was not on Japan's side. He had spent years in America, studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché, walked through the dock and steel mills of Pittsburgh, watched ships slide down the ways at Newport News, stood in farmlands that stretched beyond the horizon. He had witnessed American industrial might with his own eyes. In a documented conversation with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in 1940, Yamamoto had been brutally honest. "If we are ordered to do it, then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months, but I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." 6 months after Pearl Harbor, that clock was ticking. Japan had run wild, exactly as Yamamoto predicted. Hong Kong fell in 18 days, Manila in 26. Singapore, the supposed Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in 70 days. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, all conquered. The Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, had sunk 5 battleships at Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin in Australia, driven the British Eastern Fleet from the Indian Ocean. Everywhere the Japanese carriers went, they brought destruction, but the American carriers remained untouched. Enterprise and Lexington had been at sea during Pearl Harbor. Hornet arrived in the Pacific too late to be caught, and these carriers continued to strike at Japanese forces, disrupting operations, threatening supply lines, proving that American naval power was far from broken. The solution, Yamamoto argued, was Midway, a pair of tiny islands, just 6 square miles of coral and sand, located 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. In Japanese hands, Midway would serve as an advance base, a refueling station for submarines, a platform for long-range reconnaissance. But more importantly, Midway would serve as irresistible bait. When the Americans came to defend their westernmost outpost, when they sailed from Pearl Harbor to prevent its capture, the superior Japanese fleet would destroy them in the decisive battle Japanese naval doctrine had always envisioned. The Kantai Kessen, the culmination of 4 decades of planning and training. The plan was elegant, multiple forces operating across thousands of miles of ocean, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north, the main invasion force approaching Midway from the west, the carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, attacking from the northwest to destroy American air power on the atoll, and behind them, hundreds of miles back, the main body built around the massive battleship Yamamoto, ready to deliver the knockout blow when the American fleet appeared. Over 200 ships, the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled, against what Japanese intelligence calculated as 2, perhaps 3 American carriers. The numbers seemed overwhelming. The victory seemed certain. In early May 1942, staff officers gathered aboard the Yamamoto at Hashirajima anchorage for war games to test the plan. The games ran for 4 days. Multiple scenarios were played out on large plotting boards. Dice were rolled to determine outcomes. On the second day of the games, something happened that should have changed everything. The umpire, following the rules, rolled dice to determine the results of an American bomber attack on the Japanese carriers. The result was 9. Enough, according to the game mechanics, to sink 2 carriers. Akagi and Kaga, the most powerful ships in the fleet, were ruled sunk by American land-based aircraft from Midway. Admiral Motomi Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, stared at the board. 2 carriers gone. The entire operation compromised before the decisive battle even began. It was, he decided, ludicrous. Ugaki refused to accept the result. He argued that the Americans would not be so aggressive, that even if they were, Japanese fighters would intercept them, that the carrier's anti-aircraft guns would devastate any attacking force. The rules were flawed. The outcome was unrealistic. He overruled the umpire, reduced the hits from 9 to 3. Akagi was still afloat. Kaga's destruction stood, but even that carrier would mysteriously reappear in later games covering subsequent operations. The war games continued. The plan was validated. Participants returned to their ships confident in the operation's success. A few voices of concern were dismissed as overly cautious. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, expressed doubts about the operation's complexity and the vulnerability of carriers caught while rearming aircraft. He was ignored. The victory disease had infected even the most brilliant minds in the Imperial Navy. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that the Americans were reading their mail. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been breaking into the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code since early 1942. By May, they were reading enough traffic to understand Japanese intentions. They knew an operation was planned. They knew the objective was codenamed AF. They needed to confirm what AF meant. Captain Wilfred Holmes devised an elegant trap. He had the base at Midway broadcast an uncoded message via secure underwater cable, stating that Midway's water purification system had broken down. Within days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short on water. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew everything. He knew the target. He knew the date would be early June. He knew the composition of the Japanese force. He knew the approach routes. More importantly, he knew he could prepare an ambush. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May had cost both sides carriers. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and had the fleet carrier Shokaku badly damaged. The Americans lost Lexington, but more significantly, Yorktown had taken bomb damage that should have required 3 months of repair. Pearl Harbor. Navy Yard mechanics had other ideas. 1,400 workers laboured around the clock. They patched holes in the flight deck, replaced damaged plating, repaired electrical systems and fire mains. Work that should have taken 90 days was completed in 72 hours. Good enough for one more battle. On May 28th, Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher steamed from Pearl Harbor. Yorktown was listing slightly. Her repairs were incomplete, but she was combat ready. 2 days later, she rendezvoused with Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, built around Enterprise and Hornet. 3 American carriers took up position at Point Luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway, hidden, waiting. Already in position before the Japanese submarine cordon arrived to watch for ships leaving Pearl Harbor, the Japanese eyes that might have warned of the American ambush were systematically blinded. The submarine patrol line arrived too late. Operation K, the planned reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor by flying boats refueling at French frigate shoals, was cancelled when American ships occupied the anchorage. Japanese scout planes had limited range and covered inadequate search sectors. The Japanese sailed into battle, believing the Americans would react exactly as predicted. Sail from Pearl Harbor after Midway was attacked. Arrive piecemeal. Be destroyed by overwhelming Japanese superiority. Every assumption was wrong. On May 27th, the anniversary of Admiral Togo's victory over the Russians at Tsushima, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier striking force departed from the inland sea. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Between them, 248 aircraft, including 225 operational for combat, the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Men who had attacked Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin, struck Ceylon, sunk British warships in the Indian Ocean. These were the ships and men who had devastated every target they attacked for 6 months. Nothing had stopped them. Nothing, it seemed, could stop them now. Commander Fuchida, still recovering from his appendectomy, made a final entry in his diary before departure. "We sail with heavy hearts. This operation has been rushed. Our intelligence is poor, and the plan is too complex. But we are samurai. We will do our duty, even if it leads to death. May the gods protect Japan, for I fear we sail toward catastrophe." The carriers steamed through fog toward their launch point, maintaining strict radio silence. In ready rooms, pilots studied reconnaissance photos of Midway. The images were weeks old but showed the airfield, fuel tanks, defensive positions. What they did not show was the recent reinforcement, the additional fighters, the bombers, the radar station that would detect the Japanese strike while it was still 93 miles away. On the evening of June 3rd, American PBY Catalina flying boats spotted portions of the Japanese invasion fleet 700 miles west of Midway. This first contact electrified the American command, but Nagumo's carriers remained undetected, hidden by weather and distance. On the bridge of Akagi, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka approached Nagumo. "Sir, if the Americans have spotted the invasion force, they may be more alert than we expected." Nagumo dismissed the concern. "The invasion force is supposed to be seen. It will draw them out. Tomorrow, we will destroy their air power on Midway, and when their carriers arrive to counterattack, we will be waiting." But even as Nagumo spoke these confident words, 300 miles to the northeast, the American carriers were already at sea, already in position, already preparing to strike. At precisely 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Akagi and Kaga began launching the first wave against Midway. The launch proceeded smoothly. 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Kate level bombers, 36 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga led them into the lightning sky, circling once over the fleet before heading southeast toward Midway, 240 miles distant. As the 108 aircraft formed up and departed, Nagumo made his first fateful decision of the day. Despite doctrine calling for a full deckload strike to maximize impact, he held back 108 aircraft, Kates armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. It seemed prudent. It would prove catastrophic. Below decks in the hangar of Akagi, Commander Fuchida watched the launch from his sickbed. His absence of experience and tactical genius would be keenly felt in the hours to come. At 5 a.m., Nagumo launched his search planes, just 7 aircraft to cover a vast expanse of ocean. By contrast, the Americans had over 30 PBYs searching for the Japanese fleet. Most critically, the search plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, designated as Number 4 Scout and assigned to search the sector where the American carriers actually were, launched 30 minutes late. Various sources attribute this to catapult problems, though some suggest engine trouble. This single mechanical failure would cascade into catastrophe. At 5:34 a.m., PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard Adey spotted the Japanese carriers and transmitted the electrifying message, "Enemy carriers." He followed with more detail at 5:52. 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25. On Enterprise, Spruance made a command decision that would determine the battle's outcome. Despite the extreme range, nearly 200 miles, he ordered an immediate strike. His aircraft would have barely enough fuel to return, but he wanted to catch the Japanese when they were most vulnerable, recovering their Midway strike. Meanwhile, at 5:53, radar on Midway picked up the incoming Japanese strike 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Every available aircraft was scrambled. Marine fighters launched into the air, 20 obsolete Brewster F-2 Buffalo fighters and 7 Grumman 4F Wildcats. They were outnumbered 4-1 by the escorting Zeros. The interception occurred at 6:16 a.m. Marine Major Floyd Parks led the defenders, making his final radio transmission. Hawks at Angels 14 supported by fighters. The massacre was swift and brutal. The Zeros, with their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots, tore through the Marine formation. Within minutes, 13 Marine fighters were shot down, 4 severely damaged. Major Parks was among the dead. The Zeros lost just 3 planes. At 6:30 a.m., Tomonaga's strike force arrived over Midway. The dive bombers and level bombers executed their attacks with precision, setting fuel tanks ablaze, destroying buildings, cratering the runway. But as Tomonaga circled to assess damage, he saw something troubling. American aircraft were still taking off from the supposedly destroyed airfield. The runway, while damaged, was operational. Most importantly, none of the American aircraft had been caught on the ground. At 7 a.m., Tomonaga radioed Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack wave." This message reached Nagumo just as the first American strikes from Midway began arriving. First came 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes. The Zeros swarmed them. 5 Avengers were shot down, 2 B-26s destroyed, but 1 B-26, nicknamed Suzy Q and piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, made a desperate run directly at Akagi after dropping his torpedo. The bomber roared down the length of Akagi's flight deck, its gunners strafing and killing 2 sailors. The plane pulled up at the last second, barely clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff ducked for cover. A second B-26, heavily damaged, crashed into the ocean near Akagi's bridge, possibly attempting a deliberate ramming attack. This near miss had a profound psychological effect. The Admiral was visibly shaken. To have an enemy plane nearly crash into the bridge, it was as if the war god had given them a warning. More American attacks followed in rapid succession. 16 Marine dive bombers led by Major Lofton Henderson, who would be killed leading his squadron. 15 B-17s bombing from high altitude, 11 Marine Vindicators. All were repulsed with heavy losses, scoring no hits. But they kept the Japanese carriers dodging and weaving, unable to conduct flight operations efficiently. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo faced a critical decision. His reserve aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for ship attack, but Tomonaga needed support at Midway, and no enemy carriers had been spotted. After heated discussion with his staff, Nagumo issued the order that sealed his fate. "Remove torpedoes. load land attack bombs. This violated Yamamoto's explicit orders to maintain readiness for anti-ship operations. Down in the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, chaos erupted. Ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with smaller land attack munitions. Against regulations and safety protocols, the removed torpedoes were stacked in the hangar spaces rather than being returned to the magazines far below. There was not time. Bombs were piled near the aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere as planes were refueled. The hangar deck looked like a bomb factory. One spark and they would all be dead. At 7:28 a.m., everything changed. The Tones delayed scout plane, number 4, finally reported. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Nagumo immediately signaled. Ascertain ship types. The response did not come for 12 agonizing minutes. Meanwhile, the rearming continued, the hangar decks becoming increasingly cluttered with ordnance. At 7:45 a.m., another American strike arrived. 16 marine dive bombers from VMSB 241. The Zeros savaged them, shooting down 8, but the attacks kept coming, forcing violent evasive maneuvers that prevented flight operations. Nagumo was trapped in an impossible position. His fighters were running low on fuel and ammunition from fighting off continuous attacks. Tomonaga's strike force would return soon, also low on fuel. His decks were spotted with aircraft being rearmed, and somewhere out there were American surface ships, possibly carriers. At 8:09 a.m., Tone number 4, Scout finally clarified. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo breathed a sigh of relief. No carriers. He continued rearming for a second Midway strike, but at 8:20 a.m., another message shattered his composure. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu, immediately signaled Nagumo at 8:30 a.m. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi, aggressive and decisive, saw the danger clearly. Every minute of delay increased vulnerability. But Nagumo hesitated. His aircraft were in chaos, some armed with bombs, some with torpedoes, many not armed at all. His fighters needed to land and refuel. Tomonaga's returning strike was approaching. To launch now would mean a partial, uncoordinated attack with no fighter escort, violating every principle of Japanese carrier doctrine. Captain Kusaka counseled caution. If we attack piecemeal, we'll suffer heavy losses for little gain. Better to recover our aircraft, properly arm them, and launch a fully constituted strike according to doctrine. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Nagumo, always cautious, always by the book, sided with Kusaka. We will recover Tomonaga's force, rearm and refuel properly, and then strike with full strength. This decision, logical, prudent, and completely wrong, sealed the fate of the Kido Butai. As Tomonaga's planes landed, starting at 8:37 a.m., and were struck below to be refueled and rearmed, the hangar decks became death traps. Fuel lines were everywhere. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered about. The constant cycling of elevators brought planes up and down. Safety protocols were completely abandoned in the rush to prepare for launch. No one noticed the first American torpedo planes appearing on the horizon until it was too late. At 9:20 a.m., the first American carrier planes arrived. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Without fighter escort, flying obsolete aircraft at just 100 knots, barely above the waves, they bore in against the entire Japanese fleet. The Zeros on combat air patrol, finally with worthy targets after hours of fighting off land-based attacks, descended like hawks on pigeons. The massacre was total. One by one, The slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers were shot down. All 15 were destroyed. Of 30 aircrew, only 1 survived. Ensign George Gay, who would float in the water, hiding under his seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold. Not a single torpedo hit. At 9:54 a.m., 14 devastators from Enterprise's VT-6 arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Again, the Zeros swarmed down. 10 were shot down. 4 escaped. No hits. At 10:12 a.m., devastators from Yorktown's VT-3 attacked, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. 10 more shot down. Still no torpedo hits. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived. It seemed like another slaughter for nothing. On the bridge of Akagi, there was relief, even celebration. The American attacks had been repulsed with terrible losses. Not one carrier was damaged. The pilots who had just landed from the Midway strike were being debriefed, their aircraft refueled and rearmed. Everything was proceeding according to the revised plan. Nagumo ordered the strike force to prepare for launch at 10:30 a.m. Victory seemed within grasp. Within minutes, 87 aircraft would launch, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, all properly armed, all with fighter escort. The American carriers would be found and destroyed. The decisive battle would be won. But high above, unnoticed, with every zero at sea level, 2 groups of SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, had searched beyond his calculated interception point, gambling his fuel to find the Japanese. He had been about to turn back when he spotted the destroyer Arashi speeding northeast at full speed. The destroyer had been depth-charging the submarine USS Nautilus and was now racing to rejoin the fleet. McCluskey made an intuitive leap. He followed the destroyer's wake. It led him directly to the Kido Butai. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different direction at the same moment. Pure coincidence. The attacks that had been launched separately, that had become separated by navigation errors and fuel concerns, converged on the Japanese carriers at precisely 10:20 a.m. At 10:20 a.m., lookouts on Akagi screamed, "Hell divers!" But it was too late. With the Zeros at sea level, with the decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, with bombs and torpedoes scattered throughout the hangar spaces, the Japanese carriers were perfectly vulnerable. Every factor that could maximize damage was present. The timing was not just good, it was catastrophic for Japan. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,500 feet. Behind him, his squadrons rolled into their attack dives. The rising sun insignia on the carrier decks below grew larger, becoming perfect targets in the crystalline Pacific morning. McCluskey led most of his bombers against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best pulled 3 aircraft out of the dive and headed for Akagi. Almost simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers plunged toward Soryu. The Japanese carriers, recovering from violent evasive maneuvers and with their decks crowded with aircraft, were caught at their most vulnerable moment. The moment the war games had predicted, the moment Ugaki had dismissed as unrealistic. On Kaga, 4 bombs struck in rapid succession. The first, a 1,000-pound bomb, exploded near the bridge at 10:22 a.m., killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his command staff instantly. The second struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck where fueled aircraft exploded in chain reactions. The third and fourth bombs turned the ship into an inferno. The bombs themselves were not the primary killers. It was what they ignited. Aviation fuel erupted across the hangar deck. Torpedoes that had been carelessly stacked detonated with tremendous force. Bombs stored improperly exploded in sympathetic detonations. Within minutes, Kaga was a floating torch with ammunition cooking off and aviation fuel, creating walls of flame that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Men trapped in the hangar deck died instantly or were incinerated trying to escape. Damage control parties found water mains ruptured, power failed, communications cut. The carrier that had participated in every major Japanese operation since Pearl Harbor was dying. Akagi took just one direct hit at 10:24 a.m. from Lieutenant Best's bomb, but it was enough. 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, among 18 aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The induced explosions of the improperly stored ordnance were catastrophic. Torpedoes detonated. Bombs exploded. Aviation fuel created an unstoppable conflagration. Commander Fuchida, watching from the bridge, heard the scream of the dive bombers seconds before impact. He looked up to see 3 black aircraft plummeting toward his ship. A terrible silence hung over the ship for an instant. Then the first bomb hit. The explosion lifted him off his feet. Smoke and flame erupted from the hangar deck. He watched in horror as Kaga and Soryu also erupted in flames simultaneously. 3 carriers burning at once. The scene was, in his words, horrible to behold. Bridge personnel reported that within 2 minutes, the entire hangar deck was an inferno. The heat was so intense that paint blistered on bulkheads 50 feet away. Men fleeing the hangar deck emerged, with their clothing on fire, their skin blackened by burns. Those who made it to the flight deck found no escape. The deck itself was becoming too hot to stand on as fires raged below. Soryu suffered 3 direct hits in her hangar spaces at 10:25 a.m. Lieutenant Leslie's bombers placed their ordnance with deadly precision. 13 Val dive bombers, 3 Zero fighters, and 4 Kate torpedo bombers on the flight deck were blown apart. Below in the hangars, the stacked torpedoes and bombs created secondary explosions that tore through the ship's vitals. Captain Ryusaku Yamamoto refused to leave his burning ship. According to testimony from Chief Petty Officer Abe, who was sent to rescue him, Yamamoto was last seen on the bridge, sword in hand, singing the national anthem, Kimigayo. As flames engulfed the command structure, the attack lasted 5 minutes. When it was over, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded. Akagi, flagship of the carrier striking force, was burning out of control. Kaga, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major Japanese operation, was consumed by explosions. Soryu, the smallest of the fleet carriers, was engulfed in flames. More than 240 aircraft were destroyed, either burned on the flight decks or trapped in the hangar decks below. Over 700 highly trained pilots and aircrew were dead or would die in the fires. The calculations had been wrong. Every calculation. Japan had calculated they would face 2 carriers, perhaps 3. All 3 were present and had launched full strikes. Japan had calculated the Americans would arrive after Midway was secured. They had been waiting in ambush. Japan had calculated their reconnaissance would detect approaching threats. The Tone scout plane had launched 30 minutes late. Japan had calculated they could rearm and launch before any threat materialized. The Americans had caught them in the worst possible moment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Nagumo, shaken by the explosions, attempted to maintain command from Akagi's bridge, but fires were spreading. Smoke filled the bridge. At 10:46 a.m., he abandoned ship, climbing down a rope to escape the flames. His staff followed. They transferred to the light cruiser Nagara. From there, Nagumo could only watch as his striking force burned, the force that had been invincible for 6 months, the force that had calculated it would destroy the American carriers with overwhelming superiority, the force that had ignored the wargame's warning. On Akagi, damage control parties fought desperately. Captain Taijiro Aoki remained on the bridge, trying to regain control of his ship, but the fires could not be contained. Explosions rocked the carrier as aviation fuel and ordnance detonated. The hangar deck became an inferno. Men trapped below decks died in the flames or jumped into the sea. The air officer looked at Fuchida and said they would not be able to stay on the bridge much longer. Fuchida, already injured, could only watch as the carrier that had carried the attack to Pearl Harbor died. 267 men would perish aboard Akagi. Kaga's fate was similar. The multiple bomb hits had created fires that raged out of control. The carrier's damage control systems had been designed for single hits, not multiple simultaneous explosions. Water mains ruptured. Power failed. Communications between decks were cut. Men fought fires with no water, no power, no coordination. The ship's list increased as water flooded lower compartments. By afternoon, the order was given to abandon ship. 811 men died aboard Kaga. Soryu suffered the fastest death. Captain Yamamoto refused to leave his ship. His executive officer and others begged him to abandon the burning carrier. He refused. He would go down with his ship, Soryu's. Hull was relatively thin compared to the larger carriers. The fires burned through bulkheads more quickly. The ship developed a severe list. At 7:13 p.m., on June 4th, Soryu rolled over and sank, taking Captain Yamamoto and 711 crewmen with her. But one Japanese carrier remained. Hiryu had been several miles north of the other three carriers during the American attack. She escaped the devastation. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, immediately prepared a counterstrike. At 10:50 a.m., while the other three carriers burned, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. At 1:30 p.m., these aircraft found and attacked Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits that set her afire and knocked out her boilers. American damage control parties worked frantically. Within 2 hours, incredibly, Yorktown was underway again, making 20 knots. American damage control had proven vastly superior to Japanese procedures. Yamaguchi, aggressive to the end, immediately prepared a second strike. At 1:31 p.m., only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros were available, led by Lieutenant Tomonaga from the morning Midway strike. Tomonaga's left-wing fuel tank had been damaged during the attack. Maintenance crews only had time to fuel his right tank. Offered a chance to switch planes, Tomonaga refused. Every aircraft was needed. He knew it was a one-way mission. His fuel would only last for the attack run. At 2:30 p.m., Tomonaga's small force found Yorktown, now making 19 knots after heroic damage control efforts. American fighters tore into the formation. Tomonaga held his course, despite his plane catching fire from fighter attacks. His burning aircraft maintained its torpedo run until the very last moment, releasing its torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown at 2:45 p.m., tearing open her port side and causing a 26-degree list. This time, the damage was fatal. At 3 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned. The carrier that had been patched up in 72 hours, that had contributed dive bombers to the strike that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers, was now dead in the water. But American revenge was swift. Scout planes from Yorktown located Hiryu. At 5 p.m., dive bombers from Enterprise attacked. 24 Dauntless bombers dove on the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs hit Hiryu. 2 near the forward elevator, 2 amidships. The bombs started fires that quickly spread. Aviation fuel ignited. The hangar deck became a mass of flames. By 6:30 p.m., Hiryu was burning out of control. Her flight deck a twisted mess of burning metal. He and Captain Tomio Kaku stayed aboard the burning carrier, preferring death to the dishonor of survival after defeat. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu was scuttled by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with their ship, along with 392 officers and men. As the sun rose on June 5th, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force lay on the bottom of the Pacific in water over 17,000 feet deep. With them were 3,570 men. Of these, 2,181 died on the carriers. Akagi lost 267. Kaga 811, Hiryu 392, Soryu 711. The survivors picked up by destroyers were immediately segregated from the rest of the fleet to prevent news of the disaster from spreading. They were confined below decks, forbidden to communicate with anyone. The disaster was so catastrophic that it had to be hidden even from Japan's own forces. The journey home was one of shame and silence. When the fleet returned to Japan at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14th, they anchored at night to avoid observation. The wounded were offloaded in darkness, classified as secret patients, and taken to isolated naval hospitals where they were kept under virtual arrest, quarantined even from their own families. The systematic cover-up began immediately. The government prepared its propaganda. The sunken carriers, Akagi and Hiryu, remained on the official roster as unmanned to maintain the fiction they still existed. No flag officers were court-martialed or even officially reprimanded, as this would require admitting defeat. On June 5th, while the ships still burned, Tokyo Radio announced to the Japanese people that naval and air forces of the Empire had succeeded in inflicting heavy damage on American fleet and air forces in the Central Pacific. Later broadcasts added that Japan had achieved another smashing victory with 2 American carriers sunk. The Japanese people celebrated in the streets, unaware they were cheering a catastrophe. The calculations had promised victory. The reality had delivered annihilation. The contrast with American losses was stark. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, which was already damaged and should not have been in the battle. A Japanese submarine would finally sink her on June 7th. The destroyer Hamon was sunk by the same submarine attack with 80 dead. Total American aircraft losses were 147 planes. Total personnel losses were 307 men. The exchange ratio was catastrophic for Japan. 4 carriers for 1, 248 aircraft for 147, approximately 3,000 men for 307. But the real difference was industrial capacity. The United States could replace its losses. Japan could not. Yorktown was one of 7 American carriers in commission. 2 more, Essex and Independence, would be commissioned before the end of 1942. By the end of 1943, the United States would commission 13 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers. By the end of the war, the United States Navy operated over 100 carriers of all types. Japan could not match this production. Japanese shipyards could build perhaps 1 carrier per year under ideal conditions. The industrial base was too small. The resources were limited. The skilled labor was insufficient. Japan had begun the war with 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. After Midway, 4 of the fleet carriers were gone. The 2 fleet carriers damaged at Coral Sea, Shokaku and Zuikaku, would not return to service for months. Japan's carrier force was crippled. The pilot losses were even more devastating. Japanese naval aviation training took years to produce combat-ready pilots. The standards were extremely high. The washout rate was severe. Japan had perhaps 1,500 highly trained carrier pilots at the start of the war. After Midway, perhaps 1,000 remained, and the training pipeline could not produce replacements fast enough. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups would be filled with minimally trained pilots, flying obsolete aircraft against American pilots with hundreds of hours of training in the most advanced aircraft in the world. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft would attack the American fleet in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding from the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received the news of the disaster in disbelief. He had assembled over 100 ships for the Midway operation, the most powerful fleet Japan had ever sent to battle. He had calculated he would annihilate the American carriers. Instead, his own carrier force had been destroyed. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order to abandon the Midway operation and withdraw. The invasion fleet turned for home. The withdrawal was humiliating. The landing force that was supposed to occupy Midway never got close. The battleships that were supposed to bombard the island into submission never fired a shot. The calculations had all been wrong. The war games had predicted disaster. The prediction had been dismissed. Now the disaster was complete. To his diary, Yamamoto confided thoughts that would only be discovered after the war. I gambled and lost. In trying to destroy the American carriers, I have lost our own. The war is not lost yet, but I fear I have lost the means to win it. His prediction to Prime Minister Konoe had proven prophetic. Japan had indeed run wild for 6 months, exactly as he had foreseen. Now, at Midway, occurring precisely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide had turned. The calculations that promised victory had delivered defeat. The industrial might Yamamoto had witnessed in America would now grind Japan down. The path from Midway to Japanese defeat was clear and inevitable. Without carrier air superiority, Japan could not defend its conquered territories. Without the territories, Japan could not access the resources, especially oil, that sustained its war machine. Without resources, industrial production declined. Without industrial production, the military could not replace losses. The spiral was irreversible. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, the reality slowly sank in. Despite the propaganda, the planned invasions of Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii were quietly cancelled. Instead, Japan was forced into a defensive war it could not win. The Americans, their confidence soaring, began planning their counteroffensive. Guadalcanal, just 2 months away, would begin the long, bloody American advance toward Japan. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated since the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, was shattered forever. Within the Navy itself, bitter recriminations began immediately, though never publicly. Admiral Nagumo, made a scapegoat for the defeat despite following orthodox doctrine, was relegated to shore duty. He would never command carriers again. In 1944, during the American invasion of Saipan, where he commanded ground forces, he committed suicide rather than face capture. The defeat also exposed fundamental flaws in Japanese military culture: the inflexibility of thinking, the inability to adapt to unexpected situations, the blind adherence to doctrine even when circumstances changed. All these cultural traits that contributed to the defeat were recognized but could not be changed. Perhaps most critically, the Japanese had underestimated American capabilities while overestimating their own. They assumed Americans could not break their codes. They had. They assumed Yorktown could not be repaired quickly. She was fixed in 72 hours. They assumed American pilots were inferior. At Midway, American dive bomber pilots proved devastatingly effective. The war games had calculated disaster. The umpire's dice had shown 9 hits. 2 carriers sunk. Admiral Ugaki had dismissed it as unrealistic. He had overruled the result, reduced the damage, validated the plan. But on June 4, 1942, at 10:22 a.m., reality delivered its own results. Not 9 hits, but enough to sink 3 carriers in 5 minutes and doom a 4th by day's end. The dice had been more accurate than the Admiral's judgment. The greatest irony of Midway was that it achieved Yamamoto's goal, just in reverse. It was indeed the decisive battle he had sought, but it was Japan, not America, that was decisively defeated. The carriers he had tried to trap had instead trapped him. The ambush he had planned became the ambush he suffered. The calculations had promised that superior training, superior fighting spirit, and operational excellence would overcome American industrial advantages. Midway proved this belief catastrophically wrong. Industrial capacity mattered more than fighting spirit. Intelligence mattered more than operational planning. The side that could replace losses faster would win. The side that could read the enemy's plans would win. At Midway, in 5 minutes, all of Japan's calculations were consumed by fire. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.